Okay, so Nick, I want to talk to you about the Visionaire shoot that you collaborated with Lee on, which I think is one of your most famous shoots, purely because that amazing image of Devon is on the cover of your book. The first thing I want to talk to you about is that period of magazines, because it's something I know that Claire Wilcox has talked about in relation to the curation of the exhibition of Savage Beauty at the Met and the V&A. Because I think a lot of the way your work was seen with Lee, it was through things like the amazing fashionable shoot that you did for Days, in the issue that he guest edited, but also things like Visionaire. Were you aware at the time that that you were having great freedom with these magazines and there was great sort of editorial coming out, or is it something that kind of looking back people have put into history?
I don't think it ever felt like we had great freedom, because that was sort of imply that we thought it was something that we got as a special thing. So I started photography right back in the end of the 70s. That's before magazines like The Face and ID, and they started as I was starting, really. So I grew up with the idea that I'd have vehicles to publish my work through, like The Face or ID, and later Dazed, and then Visionaire and Numero and all those sort of magazines over the last sort of 30, 40 years. So it was accepted this was they started as a sort of counterculture. When I first started, the magazines were Cosmopolitan, Elle magazine, Vogue magazine, Marie Claire, and I came out of college as a sort of slightly arrogant, awkward skinhead, and I wasn't going to get employed by any of those. I remember being told by one of the magazines, we only want pictures of pretty girls. So I put my pictures of skinheads away then. So there wasn't a sort of, there wasn't really much space for me within existing magazine world. And then, quite happily, or by good chance, good fortune, The Face and ID started, which gave my generation of image makers platforms to speak. So ID would allow us to photograph our friends. The Face would allow us to photograph people we couldn't get access to, so singers or fashion designers or whatever it was. So there were these sort of good vehicles for us to work through. So, but that's these images were shot in the 90s. The Face and ID started in the 80s. So we were I was in a 15-year-old culture of that. On top of that, my first sort of international fashion photography had been for luxury catalogues for Yohji Yamamoto, which was sent out to perhaps 2,000 sort of opinion leaders throughout the world, and they were just a distilled vision of Yohji Yamamoto. It's re-exploded, if you want, and shown to him, because weirdly, well not weirdly, but coincidentally, Yohji, like Lee, wouldn't ever really want to photograph the clothes. You always say, photograph my dreams, not my clothes. And Lee had a very sort of similar relationship to photographing his clothes. So I had the luxury, if you want, I think, incredibly beautifully funded and made catalogues for Yohji Yamamoto, which I shot with Marc Ascoli, the great French art director, and Peter Saville, the great British graphic designer, and then this sort of counterculture magazine, so The Face and ID. So that was my. I knew they were there. There wasn't a sort of a freedom or a choice or a luck or whatever. They were there, so we used them.
And how did this shoot come about? Who commissioned it? How was it suggested? Was it? Sorry, I'm really pushing.
No, it's fine. It was for Visionaire. It's Stephen Gann and Cecilia Dean, and they started Visionaire. I remember seeing them at the shows, actually, right back in the middle of the 80s. They had a little kind of, as you walked into the Paris shows, into the Cour Carré du Louvre, there was a little stall, and they literally had kind of copies of Visionaire there.
That's so sweet.
So we sort of got chatting to them, and of course then Visionaire grew up into what it was become, and now V Magazine and everything else. But at the time it was very small, but they'd started doing this thing which was quite unique, which is to do these sort of crafted editions, where it was on a theme, and they'd approach various people. I think this one was for Rei Kawakubo, was guest editor of it, which meant people had to some degree interact with her work. But it was a sort of a slightly, it's a nice idea, but it was like a lot of these things. They're slightly, they're not that arduously put through. You ask Ray to do it, and then that's about it. See what comes through. So, but anyway, so Lee was doing a session that was slightly based on a relationship or a collaboration with Rei Kawakubo, and the one you mentioned of Devon plays on all of that sort of Japaneseism of sort of the manga cartoon and the manga heroine. So the girl, if you look at a lot of manga cartoons, She's often incredibly young, so she's a sort of 12-year-old schoolgirl who's been virtually annihilated by some huge power, like some sort of alien power or evil government power that's physically beaten her up, and she's missing an eye and a bit of an arm, but somehow she has the sort of inner strength to kind of take down this massive machine killer thing that's coming towards her with her whatever it is. And it was that sort of incredibly fragile and frail and delicate outside, but with this steel will and sort of power behind that facade. So in the picture of Devon, she's missing an eye, she's got a gash on her forehead, but actually the power that she has standing in front of that camera is what it's about. It's what, our friend who does those movies like Kill Bill, director who does Kill Bill, I'm awful, Tarantino. I'm so sorry. Awful, I can remember his name. Anyway.
When you said our friend, I was like, who are my friends with that does Kill Bill?
I mean, we all know his films. His heroine, or one of the anti-heroine in Kill Bill, is the Japanese girl that comes down, looking like a schoolgirl, but with a kind of mace on the end of a thing, and then turns out to be a total psychopath. But the power of that, wrapped in that fragile exterior, and that delicate, fragile exterior.
Which I guess that's a contradiction that underpins a lot of Lee's work, isn't it, as well? That idea of beauty and fragile, but also this darkness.
Well, he got a lot of flack, not necessarily for this particular image, but for the image, or some of the images around this time, for being a misogynist. Which always struck me as totally the opposite to what he was. I mean, Lee wanted to create, his vision of women was incredibly powerful women. They had to live through a kind of shit life where they were beaten up, or but they fought back and they became powerful. That was always his. Sorry.
I was just going to say it's interesting as well, because I think he also championed that women could be weak if they wanted to be, and I think a lot of people that make women really strong, it's not that empowering, because you think, but what about women if they're having a shit time? And as you say, he kind of allowed for both, and I think that's such an interesting idea.
I mean, it's like the stupid thing about people accusing John of being anti-Semite, which it couldn't be further from the truth, although that obviously there's a dreadful sort of that tape of him, but I know John very well, and he's not like that, and I knew Lee very well, and he was not a misogynist. So these things are put about in the press by people who don't know them. And I think one should be careful labelling people so carelessly.
But do you think people found his work quite hard to read? Because another of the image in the Visionaire thing is, the girl wearing that kind of, the shackle piece that Deborah Shaw wore in the show, and I think that got a huge amount of flack because of Deborah Shaw's ethnicity, people related it to slavery, and it's funny actually because Katie England, when she was in the other day, I don't think it was on camera, she said the only reason it was Deborah who was wearing it is because it fitted her. It was nothing to do with that.
No.
But, that was really controversial as well. But do you think people just weren't quite sure how to read his work, so it was almost easier to be offended?
Yes, well, I think people read it through their own particular prejudices. So I think people who are sensitive to that sort of thing, and often people who've got very good reason to be sensitive to that sort of thing, but I think they implied that narrative on it, which wasn't there. I mean, I knew for the Deborah Shaw, for the piece, it was a Hans Bellmer piece, and it was inspired by a sort of mechanical doll, those sorts of things. And Deborah Shaw was the only girl that fitted it. She was also a girl of colour. So, and I know for absolute sincerity, and Lee would never thought it was about race. He thought it was about the sort of Hans Bellmanness of the sort of the doll woman, and he would never try and make women look sort of victims. He was always this kind of he's always about this sort of a completely different anti-misogynistic stance. So it's sort of, I find it frustrating in the end. Who cares? But I find it frustrating that he got some of these labels, which he clearly didn't deserve, and just actually was down to sloppy reporting, in my opinion. Were
you aware of that controversy though when you were shooting that picture of that same piece?
I think so. I couldn't be sure now because all these things happen over time, so it's like
blur into one.
But blurred into sort of one event. I was aware there was controversy over it. I was aware at the show, It's a Jungle Out There, that afterwards there was sort of, some journalists were very upset about it. And I think, no, I didn't get that at all. And I think that was probably later than that. So it wasn't, it happened then, but it would happen. It was a criticism that was levelled at him a couple of times, at least.
But it never affected how you shot. You never were kind of keen to readdress criticism?
No, I really don't. We weren't, and quite naturally weren't, because it was not a reality for us. Neither Lee nor I were working in any format or frame that was racist or misogynistic. So it was never, you don't deal with something that doesn't exist. And we weren't, neither of us were creating images out of any sort of desire to reinforce any of those stereotypes. The desire was to break every stereotype. So we would never react to that.
So what was the aim with the shoot then? Was it just to kind of, as you say, almost like work with the pieces you had and work within that Ray Kawakubo brief, or what were you aiming for? Is that kind of?
I guess we would, again, it's a chance to work with his clothes, and to work with his imagery and work with his world, and through Visionaire and this Ray Kawakubo collaboration, it was just a pleasure. I mean, we were finding ways, not excuses, wrong word. We were finding vehicles that would support us working together. So that was mostly, it was a joy of creating images together and actually working together.
And how far down the collaboration was this? Was this still, to you, I know time-wise, but to you, was this still quite early on? Or did you feel like you knew him quite well by this point? No,
I think I kept on finding out about him. Lee and I weren't, I think we were emotionally close, i.e. that we understood each other as people. I didn't socialise with him, I wasn't a mate. I wasn't, we didn't see each other outside. I don't think he ever came to my house, I don't think I ever went to his. I don't like parties, he didn't think he did particularly either. So we wouldn't, there was no place for us to hang out. And I didn't, I'm not a young gay man, I wasn't then. Really? So I wasn't going out in his world, and we were at different parts in our different, our lives were very different, sort of personally. And we didn't have any desire to kind of try and meld those together.
But do you think that made when you did come together, it was almost stronger because there's such a kind of an excitement to see
Yes,
each other
I think there's the weird thing is a relationship you do have with people and how you find that sort of way of working together and the sort of, you have a love for somebody really. Yeah. And that's what it's about, and it's sort of that relationship, which is what we tried to work on a lot. Not we tried to work on, that sounds silly. That's the relationship that we enjoyed most. Yeah. But it's very hard to quantify. We weren't doing it for commercial gain. Yeah. We weren't doing it to promote a campaign, or we were doing these images because we loved working together on images. Because I was thinking about this in the car this morning, it's very hard to say without sounding incredibly pretentious, but once you know that you can create exciting imagery, the idea of not doing that is just an automation. You must, it's like an addiction, but not so difficult, not so sort of awful. An addiction's got lots of negative connotations. Yeah. But once you know that you can work with Lee McQueen or John Galliano or Gareth Pugh, and you can create these images which will live and they'll be what you desire to see. Yeah. That's addictive because it's such a passion. Yeah. And you can't really think, I'll wait for somebody to pay me to do this, or I'll wait for a good reason to do this. So any reason really, whether it's Visionaire or Numero or The Face or ID of Days, was a sort of, not an excuse, that sounds unkind to magazines, but a sort of, hooray, they've given us our time again. We've got a vehicle, we've got support for doing this, somebody's got to come up with some money to get models flown in, etc., etc. Because Lee's business wasn't profitable at the time. Yeah. So most of these things were either funded by myself or funded by a magazine and myself, or so it wasn't a lot of money knocking around. Yeah. But yeah.
Did it because you wanted to? We
did it because, yes, we wanted to, and it's more than wanted to. Had to. Couldn't imagine not doing it. So.
That's a really nice way of thinking about it. Thanks, Nick.
Pleasure, Nick.